This is the 70th issue of our INOC DigiConnect webinar, and today we will be deliberating on a new topic that will be breast cancer screening and diagnosis. And the regular COVID EPID updates will be given by our Vice President, Dr. Rajiv Kumar Jain sir. And before I invite both the speakers, may I request our President, Dr. Gajen Kumar sir, to give the welcome address.
Good evening, friends. Today again we are meeting on 70th issue of our webinar DigiConnect program, and today we have got two very important or eminent speakers with us, Dr. Manish Sharma from Rajiv Gandhi Cancer Hospital, and our Vice President Dr. Rajiv Kumar Jain. The topic is, as announced by Dr. Sandeep Sharma, is breast cancer screening and diagnosis. Will be deliberated upon by Dr. Manish, and another is COVID update that will be by Dr. Rajiv. So I welcome both the speakers, and I welcome all the participants to this webinar, and I wish it will be a great success. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So our first speaker is Dr. Manish Sharma. Dr. Manish Sharma has done his graduation and DNB in internal medicine and DNB in medical oncology, and ECMO from Europe, and he is consultant and unit head medical oncology at Rajiv Gandhi Cancer Institute, New Delhi. Today the topic which he will be discussing is breast cancer screening and diagnosis, which is very important for every one of us as industrial physicians and occupational physicians and public health physicians. And Dr. Manish Sharma, he received his President NB Gold Medal Award for securing highest rank in the medical oncology at national level in final examination, and he also gained widespread experience in the management of various malignancies like lung cancer, breast cancer, GI cancer, and other solid tumors, etc. He also has a special interest in various immunotherapies, targeted therapies, precision medicines, and personalized medicines. And he has also, to his credit, preceptorship and advanced course in oncology in various international institutes organized by European Society of Medical Oncology, and he focuses on treatment as well as helping patients manage their symptoms and improving their quality of life. For information to Dr. Manish, we are an association of industrial doctors, public health physicians, and occupational physicians from across India. And across India, we have a presence of more than 2,500 members, and in Delhi we are more than 250. And in Delhi we are from various public sector undertakings, railways, government PSUs, and public and private corporate sectors, and many public health physicians are our members. So this topic will be of great interest for every one of us. So we would like to invite you to address this particular topic about breast cancer screening and the diagnosis. So the platform is yours, Dr. Manish.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Sandeep, Dr. Gajendra. Good evening, and thank you all for being here at this evening and Saturday evening, in fact, when it's a time for all of us to relax. And it's good to see all of you here. So the topic for my today's talk is breast cancer screening and diagnosis. So I will be touching upon few points in the risk factors. I will be touching the clinical examination, how to make the diagnosis, and then a few points about treatment as well. So I will share my screen. So I think I am audible and visible also.
Yes, you are, sir.
So I think this is the most common question we are asking nowadays. Each so we will start with epidemiology. So which is I think the most important thing when we talk about cancers and how to manage them and to make our policies. So worldwide, breast cancer is the most common cancer in females, and this is true for India as well. In at least in the urban areas of India, and in the rural areas of India, cervical cancer is the most common cancer in females. And lung cancer is the most common cancer worldwide, as well as in India, apart from head and neck cancer. So if we talk about female patients, most common is the breast cancer in the urban areas like metropolitan cities, Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore, while in rural areas, still the cervical cancer is the most common cancer. So overall, in whole of the world, approximately 1.6 million new cases they are detected, and out of them, 3 lakh 24,000 deaths they happen in less developed nations, and 1 lakh 98,000 deaths in the developed nations. So we can clearly see here the disparity between the deaths in the developed nations and the underdeveloped nations, close to more than 50-60,000 more deaths being happening in the less developed nation. The reason being, one of the most important reason being the screening facilities which are not available in the less developed nations, and even if they are available, patients they are not aware and they don't come up for these screening techniques. But in the developed nations, these screening techniques they are more readily available. Patients, people, they don't get insurance without getting to these screening techniques. So this is about brief about the epidemiology of this disease. So once we are discussing about the screening and diagnosis, we should also know the risk factors for development of breast cancer. So mainly the breast cancer is the hormone dependent cancer, and hence increased exposure to the hormones in the patient's life is very important. So as we can see here, early menarche and late menopause, and the use of the oral contraceptive medicines, they are the cause of breast cancers. And if the person has a decreased exposure to these things, that is, they have late menarche or early menopause, or no use of oral contraceptive medicines, or if they have oophorectomy for any reason before menopause, or if they have multiple pregnancies, they are the people who are less who are at less risk of having breast cancer. So apart from that, the age is the very important thing, and being female is also very important. So females, women, they have more than 100 times the risk of getting breast cancer as compared to the male counterpart. And as you age, the risk of cancer increases to approximately 64 years of age, and then it decreases. Similarly, there are certain genetic mutations which are inherited by different people, such as BRCA1 and BRCA2 being most common mutation, then other TP53 mutations which are very rarely inherited. They increase the risk of cancer to the tune of approximately 50 to 60%. So 12% of all the breast cancers, they are genetic cancers. Similarly, if there is a personal history of having cancer in one breast, the patient is at risk, at very high risk of having another cancer in another breast. Or if the person or the woman has a history of multiple biopsies of breast in younger age group, although the biopsies they were benign, but these people, these women, they have more chances of getting breast cancer. So even if person has a breast biopsy and it is a benign breast biopsy, these people, these women, they are at higher risk of having breast cancer. So similarly, there are few environmental factors such as increased obesity and alcohol consumption, along with the ionizing radiation, which are important risk factors for breast cancer. Less exercise, obesity, they are important risk factors. Similarly, there are few of the children who had Hodgkin lymphoma or any kind of cancer, and they received the radiation to the chest wall. So these people, they are at more risk of developing breast cancers. So these are few of the genetic mutations which are important when we talk about screening, because when we talk about screening, we should know whom we should screen for. So there are few average risk women, there are few high risk women. So there are few genes which are very importantly implicated in breast cancer, and these are BRCA1 and BRCA2, then TP53 gene, PTEN mutation, and CHEK2 mutation. If you see, if a person is carrying BRCA1 or BRCA2 mutation, that is germline mutation, the chances of getting a breast cancer by 70 years of age is to the tune of between 40 to 90% in different studies here, and 30 to 90% in different studies here. So if we talk about average risk women, so average, when I'm talking about the average population, the lifetime risk of getting breast cancer is to the tune of 15%. But if the person is having this kind of mutation, BRCA1 or BRCA2 or TP53 mutation, the lifetime risk of getting breast cancer is to the tune of between 40 to 90%. So we should remember these kind of mutation, and we will be discussing about them in the later half of this. So those women who have BRCA1 or BRCA2 mutation, apart from having breast cancer risk of to the tune of 50 to 60%, these patients, they are also at risk of developing pancreatic cancer, the risk being 1 to 3% for the lifetime, and ovarian cancer. So BRCA1 and 2 predisposes the women for breast cancers and ovarian cancer, the risk being 60% in lifetime, and similarly pancreatic cancers, the risk being 1 to 3%. And if the person is male, the males also can have breast cancer, and the risk is to the tune of 9%, and prostate cancer to the tune of 15%. So how much breast cancer is inherited? It is between 5 to 10%, absolute value being somewhere around 12%. So what are the problems if person has the hereditary breast cancer? So hereditary breast cancer, there is earlier onset of the breast cancer in these people. So median age of developing breast cancer in women is somewhere between 50 to 60 years. 60 years is the median age in the Western population. In the Indian population, the median age is around 55 years. So we are at least a decade ahead of developing breast cancer as compared to the Western counterpart. These women also tend to have bilateral breast cancer, and they frequently have multiple other primary cancers, as I showed in the previous slide. 15 to 20% patients, they have the family history of 1 or 2nd degree relative with breast cancer, but they don't have BRCA1 or BRCA2 mutation. So 15 to 20% familial and 5 to 10% hereditary. The rest 75% patients, they are sporadic. So this is an important slide which we should know when we are talking about the screening of our patients. So sporadic is 75%. These patients, these women, basically they are at the average risk of developing breast cancer, which is to the tune of less than 15% for their whole of the lifetime, and they are called as average risk. While those women who have hereditary genetic mutations, they are considered as high risk because the chances of them developing breast cancer is to the tune of 50 to 60%. So I will quickly go through this slide. How does tumorigenesis occur? So there is first a defect in the DNA repair, and once we have a DNA repair defect, the cells, they are sufficient in growing by themselves, and they are not any longer sensitive to growth inhibitory signals. So in our body, continuously we have cell growth and cell death, and the DNA repair happens. And we all tend to have DNA repair mutations, but these mutations, they are cleared by our T cells and immune system. But these patients, they have, since they have DNA repair defect, such as BRCA1 or BRCA2, these cells, they continuously go on proliferating, and they don't stop proliferating. And hence they have limitless proliferative potential, and then eventually they invade other organ, and it leads to the metastasis or stage 4 disease. So what are the most common site of development of breast cancer? the most common site is the upper outer quadrant. So this is the most common site in which we find 57% of the breast cancer. The second most common site being the upper inner quadrant. So this is where we find 14% of the cancers, and subsequently lower outer quadrant, and then lower inner quadrant, and then the axillary tail. So whenever we are seeing our patients in clinics, we should never miss to examine this axillary tail. These axillary tail can have cancers in up to 1% of the patients. So most common being upper outer quadrant, followed by upper inner, then lower outer quadrant, and then lower inner quadrant. So what are the signs and symptoms of early breast cancer and the late breast cancer? So these are the signs and symptoms of early breast cancer. Patient can have new lump or mass. They can have breast or nipple pain, then swelling in all part of the breast, or a distinct lump sometimes is felt. Then there can be sometimes the dimpling of the skin. There can be nipple retraction, which is recent onset nipple retraction, which is important. Then thickening and scaliness of the redness of the breast, or nipple discharge other than that of the milk. So sometimes these patients, they come with the skin redness or skin dimpling or nipple inversion when it is an early breast cancer. But when it is a locally advanced kind of breast cancer, these patients, they tend to have axillary lymph node, because the first draining station for breast cancer is the axilla, and hence sometimes we may not find any lump in the breast, but if we miss the axillary examination, we can miss the breast cancer, and in those cases we can have axillary lymph node, which in fact is a breast cancer and not the just axillary lymph node. So these are important signs and symptoms of the early breast cancer. When the breast cancer becomes locally advanced, it usually metastasizes to the bone, it metastasizes to brain, it metastasizes to liver. And hence, the metastatic breast cancer has the symptoms of the organ in which the cancer invades. If somebody has a brain metastasis, the patient can present with vomiting, neurological deficit, or headache. Similarly, if there is a liver invasion, patient can have liver metastasis leading to liver dysfunction. So these are the signs and symptoms of the early breast cancer and the late breast cancer. So these are the common sites. As I discussed, a patient with a brain metastasis can have headache, ataxia, or epilepsy. Similarly, lungs are usually asymptomatic because we have a huge volume in the lung. Liver, sometimes patient present with the jaundice or ascites, and if there is a bone lesion, patient can have pathological fracture or pain. And these are the regional lymphatic spread where we should detect the patient. So axilla should always be examined.
Dr. Manish, you are mute.
So I'm back. I'm sorry. I think there was a connection error. So once we have established that patient is having some kind of breast lump, the next step is to make the clinical diagnosis, the tissue diagnosis, and then the stage of the disease. So to make the clinical diagnosis, sorry, one second. So To treat the patient, we should have the bilateral mammogram or the ultrasound. Then we need to do a biopsy to establish the diagnosis of cancer. And once we do a biopsy for breast cancer, we should also do the hormone receptor testing and the HER2/neu testing for these. I will be coming to them what they are. And if there is a positive family history, we should be doing genetic counseling. And we should do MRI, PET CT scan or CT scan and other lab tests to establish the stage of the disease. So once we have ordered a mammogram, we should know what is the Barrett's staging, Barrett's scoring of the patient. So a patient with a breast lump or a female or a woman without breast lump comes to us for just for a screening, we order a mammography for those patients. So what is the Barrett staging? So the Barrett staging was developed by American College of Radiology to standardize the format of mammography report. So when somebody sees a lesion in an X-ray mammography, somebody can say that it looks like a cancer. Somebody can say that it does not look like a cancer. Somebody can say that it needs a biopsy. Somebody can say that it does not need a biopsy. So this BI-RADS is a standard imaging and reporting data system which gives a category to our patients, in which there are 7 different categories. Category 0 means that the test was not adequately performed and another test needs to be done, while category 6 means that this is a confirmed biopsy proven malignancy. And there are intermediate categories. Category 1 is normal, that there is no lump and there is no evidence of any cancer. Category 2 says that there is a lump, but it is a benign fibroadenoma kind of lump, and the percentage of the risk of having cancer in that patient is less than 0.05%, and hence clearly no biopsy is needed. But if it is category 5 or if it is category 4, these are the patients in which the percentage of getting cancer is to the tune of 25 to 99%, and category 4 and category 5 BI-RADS on X-ray mammography should definitely be biopsied. And if you have category 3, then these patients, they have to repeat a ultrasonography or X-ray of the breast 6 months later. So whenever we are ordering for a X-ray mammography or ultrasound mammography or MRI mammography, we should ask for a BI-RADS category. Rather than just reading the report, we should read the BI-RADS category so that we can consider the patient to have a biopsy or not. So once we have established the biopsy, we have done a core needle biopsy, we should know what is the grade of the tumor. So we categorize them in 3 different ways, that is grade 1, grade 2 or grade 3, which is well differentiated tumor or moderately differentiated tumor or poorly differentiated tumor. So grade 1 is basically slow growing tumor, and grade 3 they are fast growing tumor. Once we have seen the biopsy report and we have established the grade, we should know the hormone status of this patient. So basically there are 2 hormone receptors which are present in the breast cancer cell, and these are estrogen receptor and progesterone receptor. So these estrogen receptor and progesterone receptors, they are predictive as well as prognostic. So I will come to this in my next slide, what is prognostic and what is predictive. So we order for a IHC testing and we look for estrogen receptor and progesterone receptor. Those patients who have ER or PR positive tumor, they are highly sensitive to the hormone depletion. In those patients, we give tamoxifen or letrozole. And then we should also know what is the HER2/neu status. So if there is a breast cancer tumor cell, we order for IHC testing for HER2/neu. So HER2/neu is basically a protein which is present on the tumor cell, which helps in the growth of that particular tumor cell. So we should know what is the grade. We should order for a ER, PR, and HER2/neu testing upfront when we are doing a core needle biopsy. Once we have established the diagnosis, next is to stage the disease, that whether it is stage 4, that is, it has spread to distant organs such as bone, liver, or lung, or it is early stage, which is just localized to the breast, or it is locally advanced stage, in which it has gone to the axilla or it has involved the skin. So early stage 1 is just confined to the breast, and stage 4 is a disease which is now in the bone, liver, lung, or brain, while in stage 2, the disease is in the axillary lymph node, which is a mobile axillary lymph node. The axillary lymph nodes, they are not fixed, but in stage 3, the axillary lymph nodes, they are fixed, and the disease, it has got to the internal mammary lymph node. And this is the staging system for our patient. We have to establish the tumor size. We have to look how many nodes they are positive, and we have to see for distant metastasis with the help of PET-CT scan. So if we have done a biopsy, it is breast cancer, we order for a PET-CT scan. If there is no evidence of any distant metastasis, it becomes N0. If there are lymph nodes in the axilla, it becomes N1, N2, or N3. And in the PET-CT scan, or we get the size of the tumor, and then we establish the stage of our patients. So what is the prognostic and predictive factors? So prognostic factors are the factors which decide the outcome of the patient, and predictive factors are the factors which predicts the response or lack of response to the patient. So determining the ER/PR status is very important because it helps us in deciding whether patient will have good prognosis or bad prognosis. So ER positive patients and PR positive patients, they have improved disease survival and they have good prognosis, while ER negative and PR negative tumor patients, they have poor prognosis. And in ER/PR positive patients, we give hormone depletion with the help of either tamoxifen or letrozole. And while the HER2/neu amplification or overexpression is a poorer prognostic marker, and hence this is a prognostic marker, and it is a predictive marker also, because those patients who have HER2/neu amplification, they will get anti-HER2/neu therapy, which comes in the name of trastuzumab or pertuzumab. So there are other few prognostic factors in the breast cancer. So stage is one very important, the extent of axillary involvement. Then patient age, those patients who are younger, less than 35 years of age, they have poor prognosis. They don't have very good prognosis. Involvement of lymphovascular spaces, it has poor prognosis. Similarly, ER positive, PR positive status, good prognosis. ER positive, ER negative, PR negative, bad prognosis. And HER2/neu has poor prognosis. So these are the factors which influence the treatment decision. We have discussed them: patient age, clinical stage, pathological grade, that is grade 1, 2, 3, hormone receptor status, and then the HER2/neu overexpression. Coming on to the brief 2-3 slides about the treatment decision in the breast cancer. So we have 2-3 important treatments. One is the local treatment with the help of surgery or radiation, and the other is the systemic treatment. Systemic treatment comes in the form of chemotherapy, hormonal therapy, and the targeted therapy. So this is a very simple flow chart in which we can see that those patients who have metastatic disease, that is stage 4 disease, we don't do any kind of surgery or any kind of radiotherapy for these patients. The goal is to relieve the symptom and prolong the life and the quality of life as well. So stage 4 breast cancer nowadays, at least in 2021, does not mean immediate death sentence to the patient. The survival here depends upon the plenty of factors such as estrogen receptor and the progesterone receptor and the hormone HER2/neu receptor status. Those patients who have ER/PR positive status, they tend to live for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years because of the advent of the new medicines which are called as CDK4/6 inhibitor. Those patients who have early stage disease, they straight away go for surgery, and followed by surgery, they go for chemotherapy and radiation treatment. Those patients who have locally advanced kind of breast cancer in which the cancer has gone to the axilla, these patients receive neoadjuvant chemotherapy. So neoadjuvant chemotherapy means that the chemotherapy is being given before doing surgery so that the treatment leads to the shrinkage of the tumor and easier removal of the tumor. In the neoadjuvant setting, the main goal is to shrink the tumor, to remove it easier with the help of the surgery. In the adjuvant setting, the treatment with the chemotherapy is given after the surgery has been done, and this is usually done for the small cancers. And then the chemotherapy is given to take out the microscopic disease or the micrometastatic disease for these patients. So this is the systemic flow chart for treatment of our patients. Similarly, those patients who have endocrine tumor receptor positivity, that is ER and PR positive patients, they receive tamoxifen if they are premenopausal. If they are postmenopausal, they receive anastrozole or letrozole or exemestane, which are aromatase inhibitor. Similarly, those patients who are ER negative or PR negative, that is estrogen and progesterone receptor negative, they receive just chemotherapy, no hormonal treatment. While those patients who are ER negative, PR negative, and HER2 positive, they receive trastuzumab or pertuzumab based chemotherapy. So this is a simple flow chart for the early stage and the late stage patients. So coming on to the screening part, so I discussed regarding the diagnosis, then I touched upon the treatment, and now is the screening. So screening is in fact very important. Like we take our cars to garage to get them serviced, even though there is no breakdown in the car. Similar is the concept with the screening. We screen the patients who are still well, who don't have any kind of disease, and we screen them so as to detect the cancers early. So well, it is very important question that which patient to screen. So when I'm talking about screening, we should know the risk of getting breast cancer. So one is the average risk, other is the moderate risk, and other is the high risk. So we divide our population into three different subgroups, that is average risk women who have the chances of getting breast cancer to the tune of 15% in their lifetime. High risk patient who have more than 20% chance of getting breast cancer in their lifetime, and the moderate risk patient. So in the earlier of my slides, which I showed that those patients who have family history, those patients who have radiation to the chest wall, those patients who have BRCA1 or BRCA2 mutation, they are categorized as high risk patients. They are not average risk patients. Average risk patients are those patients who have less than 15% chance of getting breast cancer in their lifetime. So these are major factors which are used to determine a risk category. So if there is personal history of breast, ovarian, tubal or peritoneal cancer, they are not average risk. Similarly, if person has family history of breast, ovarian, tubal cancer or peritoneal cancer, they are not average risk, they are high risk. Person having BRCA1 or BRCA2 mutation, these are high risk patient. Similarly, I discussed in the previous slide, those people, those women who have previous breast biopsy indicating that there is atypical hyperplasia. Atypical hyperplasia is not cancer, it is cancer in situ. These patients, they tend to have high risk. They are not categorized as average risk. Radiotherapy to the chest wall between age 10 to 30 years, they are high risk. So women who have none of these factors, they are considered as average risk. So if we want to calculate risk for our patient, there is a model which is called as GAIL model, which is available online, and we have to feed few of the history in that model, and we can get what is the risk of getting breast cancer for those patients, those population. Similarly, we have another risk assessment model which is called as BRCA-PRO, BRCA-PRO and Bodacia. So these are two different models which we use for patients who have family history of breast or ovarian cancer, and those patients who don't have family history of breast or ovarian cancer, we use GAIL model. So GAIL model, if you find a GAIL model and then you assess the risk, we can get whether it is average risk, moderate risk, or high risk. So women who have personal history of breast cancer or a confirmed or suspected genetic mutation, that is BRCA1, BRCA2, PTEN or TP53, or previous history of radiation to the chest wall, they are considered as high risk. So coming on to screening, once we have established the risk of the person in average, intermediate, or high risk. There are three different methods. One is breast self-examination, there is clinical breast examination, and then is screening mammography. So breast self-awareness and self-examination is important, and woman notices the change by knowing that how her breast normally look like or feel like. If she finds any change in her breast, it should be immediately reported. So this is the breast self-examination. Then is a clinical breast examination, which is done in the clinic by the physician, and then X-ray mammography, screening mammography. So what are the screening recommendation for the average risk woman? So there are different societies which give their recommendation for the screening of average risk. So USPSTS, this is called the US Preventive Service Task Force. It says that the screening for the female should be started at 50 years of age, and it should be stopped at 74 years of age, and it should be done biennially, that is every 2 yearly, with the help of X-ray mammography. Similarly, there are other societies which are, one is American Cancer Society or ACR, and the similar recommendations they are given by them, 40 to 45 year and annual or biannual mammography should be done as per these screening recommendations. So what are the factors we should consider for high risk women? So high risk women, they should start their breast awareness by the age of 18 years, not by the age of 30 or 40 years as in the average risk woman. The annual clinical and self breast examination should be started at age of 25 years. Annual mammography or MRI should be done starting at the age of 35 years of these patients, and not 50 years as in the average risk women. So annual pelvic examination or transvaginal sonography should also be done. CA 125 should be done if there is a high risk woman. So there are not always gains from screening. There are some harms there also associated with breast cancer screening, which includes false positive findings. Patient anxiety level sometimes goes up. Then there are overdiagnosis, false positive, leading to the unnecessary biopsies and complications which would have been avoided if we would have not done mammography or screening mammography. Unnecessary treatment and its associated risk, and the discomfort which is associated with this. So that concludes my talk. Thank you so much for patient listening. Thank you so much, sir. The session. Hello, am I audible?
Yeah.
You can stop sharing your, yeah. Thank you, Dr. Manish. This was a very elaborate presentation in very simple words and easy to understand for every one of us, that what all things we need to take care and what are the things which are there during the screening, diagnosis and management of breast cancer. Yes, as a for public health, it is important that it is a leading cause of death in female, and this is a very pertinent issue for every one of us. And this is all because of scarcity of the screening facilities, especially in India, where we are short of healthcare infrastructure. What is important is right now, as you rightly told, that what are the screening methods in which we have to start early self breast examination at the age of 18 years, then breast clinical examination by the age of 25 years. If something is suspected, then we should go for screening mammography. What I request you is, what is the role of breast ultrasound? Now we are seeing that many doctors, they are advising for the breast ultrasound over the mammography.
So it is important that we should know when should we use ultrasound. So when we are screening the older age patient, that is more than 40 or 45 years of the age, the X-ray is the preferred modality of choice. So in the younger patients, the breast, it is dense, there is less of fat and more of fibroglandular tissue. So X-ray mammography in those cases creates a lot of background noise. And since there is a lot of background noise, the lesions, they are missed. But and hence in the younger patients in which we have dense breast, in which we have less amount of fat, sorry, in which we have less amount of fat, we should be using ultrasound. So basically the choice is because of the fibroglandular tissue, the density of the breast and the fat. So older patients, they have less fibroglandular tissue, more fat, and hence X-ray is better. In the younger patients, the fat is more, sorry, fat is less, fibroglandular tissue is more, density of the breast is more. In those patients, we tend to use ultrasound.
So this particular issue brings more clarity with your explanation that in younger patient we should better use ultrasound and
so diagnostic modality of choice in the younger patients is ultrasound and MRI mammography. X-ray mammography don't do well. In the older age patients, we tend to do X-ray mammography.
X-ray mammography. So, and as per different associations, like it was biennial by AAFP and by ACOG, it is 40 years annual. So, in India, what is the recommended?
So, since we are short of infrastructure, the screening programs, they are not well established. Doing it biannually is always better, but we can always see what is the risk of the patient. So as I discussed in my presentation, we have to look at the risk of the patient. If she is an average risk woman or if she is a high risk woman. So a high risk woman with multiple family members having breast cancer or having genetic association, in those patients, we will definitely recommend doing it every yearly. But if it is an average risk woman with no family history, doing it biannually is also okay.
So what you mean to say is whenever a patient comes with some suspicious lump or some suspicious signs and symptoms of the breast cancer, then in that case we have to do first the risk assessment, then accordingly we...
No, so we are talking about two different things. One is a case in which female does not have anything. So there is no breast lump, nothing, no breast discharge. So these are the people, this is a general population in which we are doing screening techniques. We are using screening to detect breast cancer early. Another is a female which comes with a breast lump. So these are two different scenarios.
No,
One scenario.
That's what I'm saying. In screening cases, you may be suspecting something, but if it is biopsy proved or it is a definite lump, in that case you have to do the risk assessment whether
No. So risk assessment has to be done for screening those females who don't have anything. So let me make myself more clearer. So we had a woman who does not have any kind of breast lump. So we do screening for these patients. So once she comes to us, how do we decide that we have to do it annually, we have to do it biannually, or we have to start it at 40 year of age, or we have to start it at 25 year of age? In these females, we do risk assessment, right? So risk assessment is done by 2 or 3 different methods, one of which is the family history that I told. So those women who have family history, they are high risk. Those women who have BRCA1 or BRCA mutation, they have high risk. So this is a female who does not have any breast lump. She has a family history, or she has a family history of BRCA1 or BRCA2 mutation. This is high risk woman, and we will start screening them at 25 year of age. But similar is a woman who does not have any kind of family history. So this is an average risk woman, and we start screening them at 50 year of age.
okay. So like we all in our organization, we have annual medical checkup facilities. So what is your recommendation? We should do it annually after the age of 40 or after the age of 50 years? Breast mammography.
So the last slide was important slide in which I said that if we are doing screening, we can sometimes do more harm to the patient. So if we start doing this X-ray mammography at the age of 40 years, there can be some false positive or overdiagnosis as well. So screening is always associated with some kind of overdiagnosis. Sometimes it is associated with false positivity, which can lead to the more number of biopsies and more number of complications. So between 40 to 50 year of age, we should discuss this issue with the person. If they are okay with some kind of overdiagnosis, with some kind of false positivity, we started at 40 year of age. If they are not willing to have this overdiagnosis or false positivity, we should start it at 50 year of age.
Okay, Dr. Gajendra Kumar sir, you have some questions?
Yes. First of all, I compliment Dr. Manish for a wonderful presentation. He had explained everything in detail and made everything crisp and clear. My most of the questions has already been answered during your question answer session. Now my simple leading question, see, we work in an organization. I am working as chief consultant in railways, and we are dealing with a captive population of railwaymen and their families and our employees. So do you recommend that we shall be holding as we are doing for other health checkups, so we shall be holding these health camps for our female employees for screening of this breast cancer by the modality of mammography, because with the new machines, the radiation exposure is very, very minimal.
So that is very true, sir. And this is a very pertinent question, very important question. So there is very clear evidence that we can decrease the cancer mortality, breast cancer mortality, if we detect these cancers earlier in the early stage. So there is very clear recommendation about that. And as you rightly said, those digital mammograms which we use nowadays, they just give 0.7 microsievert of the radiation, which is the cumulative background radiation which we get in 3 months time when we are outside. So it is such a low dose radiation which are giving to our patient. So definitely there is a need for doing X-ray mammography at the age of 50 years, either annually or biannually, as the logistics may support. And these female patients, they should also have a cervical pap smear also.
That's
So
of course we are doing.
Along with the X-ray mammography, the pap smear should also be done.
Right.
So very true. This is definitely true.
Thank you.
Because we don't find many complications. The radiation exposure is low. Overdiagnosis and false positivity is important issue which should be discussed between 40 to 50 year of age. And by 50 year of age, definitely yes, there is no doubt about that.
Thank you.
Dr. Puneet Chandan.
Hello.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma and Dr. Sandeep Sharma. And we have Dr. Manish. I think, thank you very much for your presentation. In fact, I have no questions. I just would need your expert advice on a few things which usually gynecologists and the doctors who come, and see the first presentation of such patients, even during, let's say, during the screening, or woman reports with something. So my first question would be that, how do we look at the non-proliferative type of cysts, or, to be more precise, how do we differentiate? Could you throw some light on the simple breast cysts, which are, without atypia, or maybe they're, simple breast cysts such as galactosele, papillary apocrine changes, or maybe mild hyperplasia, which may be detected as breast cancer as a differential diagnosis. And second question, if I can follow it up on, would be, when do we do the ER/PR and HER2/neu scoring? Is at the time of the diagnosis or post-surgery? Because we normally see that it's post-surgery only that ER/PR and HER2 is done, and not at the time of the first biopsy, which is sentinel node biopsy, or FNAC, which is taken for a diagnostic purpose. And the third one would be tamoxifen. As you rightly mentioned, we now have the anastrozole. So where do you feel tamoxifen has been under controversy for quite so many years? Besides the costs which are prohibitive for some patients, anastrozole has come up recently that 1 mg per day in postmenopausal, and the patient should be there. Tamoxifen is mainly also covered as a carcinogen in FDA listing. So why were we treating using tamoxifen, which is a carcinogen in itself? And what is the role of anastrozole? Can it be given to all patients, or we have some differentiation there as well?
So thank you so much, sir. So quite a technical question, but in fact a good question. So coming on to your, I think second question I would take up first.
Sure.
So we were talking about the role of ER/PR and HER2/neu testing in the breast cancer. Should it be done upfront or it should be done post surgery? So the answer to this question is that it should be done upfront. The reason being, there are plenty of the clinical trials now to suggest that those patients who are ER negative, PR negative, and HER2/neu negative, that is triple negative breast cancer, or those patients who have HER2/neu positive breast cancer. So I'm talking about two subsets. One is triple negative breast cancer, and one is HER2/neu positive subset, in which if we proceed with neoadjuvant chemotherapy and then do surgery, and if we find that there is a good response in situ, in vivo to the tumor, that is, we achieve a pathological complete response for triple negative breast cancer, or we achieve pathological complete response for HER2/neu positive breast cancer, these patients, they tend to do very good. So there is survival advantage if the patients achieve pathological complete response. And if these patients, they don't achieve pathological complete response, another kind of chemotherapy or another kind of targeted HER2/neu treatment should be added for these patients. And hence, at least for me, the ER/PR HER2/neu testing should be done early, so as to offer them neoadjuvant chemotherapy. Then we look for in vivo response, and then change our chemotherapy post surgery to the capecitabine in case of triple negative breast cancer, and to the TDM1 in HER2/neu breast cancer, in which they will have more survival advantage.
Right.
Second question was sorry,
non-proliferative, maybe differential diagnosis on the.
Yeah. So for non-proliferative differential diagnosis, we are doing ultrasound or X-ray mammography. And so non-proliferative diseases, there are those diseases in which there is either no atypia or there are some kind of atypia, but it has not invaded the basement membrane.
Right.
So for these patients, we do ultrasound or X-ray mammography and assign them a BI-RADS category. So I discussed about this BI-RADS category. If most of the patients, they will have BI-RADS 2 category if they are non-proliferative kind of disease, and these are to be managed conservatively, sometimes with the help of antibiotics or with the help of conservative surgeries. And so many of the times we don't do biopsy for these patients. And third question was, sir?
The third question was on the anastrozole. So would you prefer anastrozole over tamoxifen, which is actually a carcinogen, cancer causing, rather than,
So we have two different drugs. One is tamoxifen and another is anastrozole. Anastrozole is basically aromatase inhibitor. So if we see the pathway of estrogens, so testosterone and the different hormones, they are converted into the estrogen with the help of aromatase enzyme, which remains active in the premenopausal women. So if we are using it, if we are using hormone suppression in the premenopausal women, it has to be tamoxifen. It cannot be anastrozole. But if we are using it in the postmenopausal women, we are using anastrozole. Regarding the cancer causing potential for tamoxifen, so we tend to do ultrasound of the abdomen every 6 months for those patients who are on tamoxifen, and we tend to look at the endometrial thickness. So most of the patients, if they have endometrial thickness of more than 7 mm, or in the postmenopausal, if they are postmenopausal, we tend to stop tamoxifen and then switch them to the letrozole. But if the patient is premenopausal, we cannot use anastrozole for these patients.
Right, sir. Thank you very much. Yeah, very rightly said, and thanks for enlightening all of us. Yeah, no more question from my side. Over to the panelists, sir.
Any other question from the panelists or the participants? They can unmute themselves and ask from Dr. Manish. Dr. Manish, because we all are working in government organizations, and like I am working in Indian Oil Corporation, and there are many medical heads from different PSUs and government organizations and private organizations. We just want to know one more take from you. Like now there are so many molecules, so many therapies which are coming, like immunotherapies, neoadjuvant chemotherapies, which have been approved by FDA. But they had not been approved by CDESCO, Director Drug Controller General of India. They just have an import license for these molecules and for import and marketing. But that permission has only been granted for clinical trials in India in specific hospitals under supervision of specific doctors. Now, suppose our patient goes to these hospitals and they give us this treatment option. What is your take? Are we supposed to pay the whole amount, or these trials, they are on subsidized basis or free?
So you are talking about, sir, clinical trial, right? I'm talking about molecules, those who have been given immunotherapy. So there are, sir, two different kind of molecule. One is the molecule which is in the clinical trial and still has not been approved. Another are the molecules which are approved. So for those molecules which are not approved and they are in clinical trial in India, patient does not pay anything from their pocket. So none of the companies they pay. The whole of the treatment, whole of the drug, they are absolutely free for those patients. But for those molecules which are already approved, I think they have made a lot of survival advantage for the patient, and I think the PSUs should approve those molecules.
No, but those molecules, they have not been given a license for as a definitive treatment for, although your FDA has given that is a standard of treatment in many countries, but in India, the approval has been given only for the clinical trials. So what my submission is, whether these trials should be on the MRP or these trials should be on subsidized cost.
I did not get your question, sir.
Dr. Puneet Chanda, can you specify that specific example of ositrolimab which has been given an import license for lung cancer?
You're talking about positinib, right, sir?
Yeah.
So
let us talk about one specific molecule. Yeah.
So positinib is still not available in India.
No, ositrolimab.
Osimertinib.
Yeah.
Osimertinib. So osimertinib is available in India.
Yeah.
It is from AstraZeneca.
It is but the license has been given only for import and for marketing. And it is only for clinical trials in India.
So DCGI has approved osimertinib for treatment of lung cancer in India, sir?
No, that is on clinical trial basis. I can provide you the certificate for that. And I have seen hospitals, they are charging on MRP for that. So what I mean to say, we should find out some modalities, because these treatments, they are good for the patients. But in case, what is the certificate or what is the approval required from the Central Drug Controller of India? What standard should be there? I just want to know the standard which is there, which says, yes, it is meant for the definitive treatment of this particular cancer.
So I think the standard, it comes from the clinical trial only, and these drugs.
That is okay. It comes from the clinical trials only, but right now the approval is only for the clinical trial.
No, sir, approval is for use in the general public by
No.
FDA. FDA has already approved the drug.
I'll share the certificate with you. Dr. Rajiv sir, would you like to say something?
Well, this is a very tricky issue. Each molecule has been treated in a different manner based on its development and application on specific population. So one has to be clear what the DCGI certificate or licensing conditions are. What happens, we tend to generalize. Each molecule has been given for a specific purpose and in specific circumstances under which the molecule can be prescribed or administered. Like some of the drugs are only to be used by people in the medical college or research infrastructure institutions. Like you are working in Rajiv Gandhi Cancer Institute, and yours is a recognized research center. So you have you can use a wider range of molecules for the patients. Then say a general hospital or a hospital which is not licensed or registered as a research center. That is what Dr. Sandeep has been mentioning.
Actually, sir, what we have come to understand that there is a subject expert committee on oncology and hematology, and that subject expert committee, SEC group, they have routine meetings and very frequent meetings on these molecules, and in their minutes also it is mentioned that it is these molecules after they are being granted import license for 2 years for clinical trials only. But what these companies are doing, they are charging from the patient, especially from the public sector and the government. So we have to come out with some policy decision. And since you are here as a medical oncologist, that's what I am asking these questions. But these are very important, relevant questions. Otherwise, these important molecules, they won't find way for the treatment of the definitive like immunotherapy is quite useful for the patient. Some targeted therapies are also very useful, but if the cost is so high, and even in other all medical oncologists, they should advocate to the some advocacy should be done with the CDESOs for definitive use of these molecules. Otherwise, what will happen? All these molecules won't be available to the general public, and the importance of these immunotherapies and targeted therapies, it is limited to the only few. So with this, I think we can conclude this particular session. A great session by Dr. Manish, and a lot of food for thought for every one of us, and quite elaboratively he has discussed from screening up to the treatment, and we have also given him a lot of queries. We will talk to you after this session later on, Dr. Manish, regarding what should be the way forward in dealing with these sort of molecules, so that it is available for the general public also. So thank you, Dr. Manish, for your sparing your valuable time for this particular session. Now the second session will be our regular COVID rapid updates by Dr. Rajiv Kumar Jain, who is our Senior Vice President. He is Senior Consultant in Railways, and he has got a lot of experience to his credit, and he is a great resource person for us, and he has been enlightening us on the occupational health issues. Yeah, like yesterday we had the 10th issue of our occupational Occu Health Escapes, and he has been giving regular COVID rapid updates from India, from local, regional, and from abroad also by WI. What is the WHO perspective? What is the global perspective? And how we should go about with this pandemic, because this pandemic is still continuing. Still, we have about 30,000 cases every day and more than 200 deaths every day. And globally also, it is still breakthrough infections are going on in America, Europe. So how we should go about with this epidemic, pandemic, that is to be heard from Dr. Rajiv Kumar. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Sandeep. You rightly said it is not yet over for COVID-19. As we will see in the data that we observe and share with all of us, as we've been doing every Saturday evening. That is important because this COVID-19 pandemic is a big opportunity to learn epidemiology and the importance of epidemiology. One should always ensure that surveillance mechanisms and ability to assess data is available with all healthcare professionals and almost essential for all occupational health professionals. So let's see the data and try to understand, try to get some insight into the situation, whether it is global, local, or regional. If you look at this graph in the slide, you would find clearly we are in the third wave at the global level. Though the different areas or different regions of the WHO are in different phases of the evolution of this pandemic. But definitely the world is into the third phase of the pandemic, a third wave of the pandemic, with America's region, that is North and South Americas, dominating, and also Europe continuing to form a substantial portion of the cases as well as deaths. If you see this situation, you will realize that we have a situation which is evolving, but clearly indicating it is not over yet. Important event I would like to share with you, an observational preprint study conducted in a tertiary care hospital setting in India compared the surge in cases recorded from March to December 2020 to that in January to July 21, when the Delta variant was in circulation. Preliminary results from the study found that the median length of stay during the pre-Delta versus Delta circulation period was 7 versus 8 days, and ICU stay 6 versus 9 days. In hospital, deaths were 1.84 times higher during the period of Delta circulation, which did not change significantly after adjusting the age and sex sex, and comorbidities. However, the study should be interpreted carefully as these are preliminary results. To note, the hospitalization rates pre and post emergence of Delta variant were also influenced by government policies, as people were encouraged to seek hospital care during pre-emergence period, that is March to December 2020, while home-based isolation was promoted widely during the circulation of the Delta variant, partly due to the pressure on the healthcare systems and the lack of available beds in many hospitals. This I'm sharing with all of us because this is a substantive data where we need to ensure that on the ground ICUs and hospital infrastructure is available and functional, even though it may not be fully utilized, to be able to tackle these kind of pandemics. Next slide, please. Now, this is the global situation in one data sheet where new cases in the last 7 days have been contributed substantially by the Americas, that's 38%, and Europe 30%, and in addition 13% in Western Pacific, and only 7% in Eastern Mediterranean and Southeast Asia region, only 10%, Africa still continuing, only 33%. Past week, 36,71,000 cases were reported globally. If we look at the change, yes, all the regions of the WHO showed a decline. If we compare 7 days versus 7 days, the decline was not there in Africa, where we saw 4% increase in number of cases. The decline was most prominent in Eastern Mediterranean region, that is 22%, 16% decline in Southeast Asia region, 7% decline in Americas region, and 4% decline in Europe, with the overall global decline of -9% total in the world. If we look at the new deaths in the last 7 days, 59,839 new deaths were reported in the last 7 days, out of which 41% were from Americas, 24% were from Europe, 11% were from Southeast Asia and Western Pacific, and 8% from Eastern Mediterranean region, and 4% from Africa. If you look at the decline, overall decline in deaths was 7 days in the past week compared with the previous week, with the highest decrease in deaths in Southeast Asia region, 27%, 20% decline in deaths in Eastern Mediterranean region, 21% decline of deaths in African region, but 7% increase in deaths in the Western Pacific region, mainly Australia. Let's look at the data in better perspective now. This is a graph of the pandemic in different regions of the WHO. On the left top, yellow color is the region of the Americas. And what do you see? You find 1, 2, 3, and 4 waves, which are yellow in color. The fourth wave is still raging in the American region of the WHO, both in North America and South America. If you look at the deaths, again, you are seeing the fourth wave of the deaths still raging in the Americas region. If you go to the right graph, where European region in light green has been shown, there again, you find the fourth wave still active, and in case of cases, and fourth wave still active in terms of deaths. Now we come to Eastern Mediterranean region with green color on the left. Cases are, each wave is showing higher than the previous wave, and it is the fourth wave going on at the present moment in the Eastern Mediterranean region, and nowhere it is likely to touch zero in the foreseeable future. If you look at the deaths also is showing the fourth wave, and each wave is showing higher number of deaths than the previous wave. Now we come to Southeast Asia region. I shall discuss this in a subsequent slide in detail, but suffice to say that it is the third wave which is on, and the third wave definitely is lower than the second wave, and number of deaths also are lower than the second wave. Second wave, as in India, was the fiercest wave that we have seen. African region also, if we look at the graph on bottom left, is the blue one. There also the third wave is going on, but here the third wave is almost equal to the second wave, and both the waves are higher than the first wave. But look at the graph on the bottom right. Western Pacific region, the cases, if you look at it, you find 1, 2, 3, 4, and fifth wave, and each wave is higher than the previous wave. Same is the case with the black line, that is at the moment there is the sixth wave of deaths in the Western Pacific region, mainly Australia. So it is behaving diversely across 6 regions of the World Health Organization, and very instructive to learn how to interpret epidemiologically the data of evolution of the pandemic. All regions have behaved differently. No graph can be compared with the other regions' graph. Next slide, please. This is the latest dashboard position of the WHO coronavirus dashboard, where cases newly reported in last 7 days were 35,50,000, out of which 13,98,000 from Americas, 11,07,000 from Europe, 3,59,000 from Southeast Asia, 1,92,000 from Eastern Mediterranean region, and 4,01,000 from Western Pacific region. Africa is still showing 90,000 cases in 7 days. So we also learn that Southeast Asia is now the 4th region in terms of number of cases in 7 days, though it was earlier showing to be the 2nd, and at one time it was the 1st. At the moment it is number 4. Now if you look at the deaths newly reported in last 7 days, 57,614 deaths have been reported in 7 days, out of which 24,877 were from Americas, 14,710 from Europe, 5,409 from Southeast Asia, Eastern Mediterranean 4,000, Western Pacific 6,000, and Africa 2,471. Now we come to the countries, and let's rank the countries. Next slide, please. This is the ranking of the countries in terms of cases newly reported in the last 7 days, where we find at the top, substantially at the top, is United States of America, with 8,92,699 cases reported in last 7 days. Brazil still reporting 2,48,957 cases in 7 days. United Kingdom still reporting 2,26,858 new cases. India is reporting now 2,13,000 cases in 7 days. Turkey 1,93,000. Russian Federation 1,41,000. Philippines 1,30,000. Malaysia 1,06,000. Iran 98,000. Thailand 88,000, and Vietnam 72,300. Now, what do you see? You find the top 11 countries in the world belong to different continents, and they belong to all regions of the WHO. So it is still a true pandemic active all over the world. There is no inkling that it can be called an epidemic instead of a pandemic. It is pandemic still working at the global level. Next slide. Now we have ranked the countries in terms of deaths newly reported last 7 days. Out of 57,614 deaths, United States reported 14,000 deaths, Russian Federation 5,600 deaths, Brazil 3,719 deaths, Mexico 3,400 deaths, Malaysia 2,300 deaths, India 2,120. So India at the moment is ranked number 6 in terms of weekly deaths in terms of countries. Iran 2,000 deaths, Turkey 1,600 deaths, Vietnam 1,500 deaths, Philippines 1,387, and Indonesia 1,100 deaths. So again, the fact that these countries belong to different continents of the world also establishes the fact that pandemic is active and evolving. Next slide, please. Now, this is the global web map where we have colored in different shades of yellow to brown with per 1 lakh population reported cases of COVID-19. The darker the color, that is the brown, dark brown, the cases are more than 30,000 per 1 lakh population, 10,000 to 30,000, 300,000 are in brown, lighter brown, and then you see different color shades of yellow. The darkest, again, the countries belong to all the continents in the world, whether they look at the right of the map or you look at the left of the map or the center of the map, the countries are there. Whether in north of the world or south of the world, the countries with a high concentration of COVID-19 cases per 1 lakh population are there. Next slide, please. This is again a map showing the concentration of deaths per 1 lakh population of countries, and the darkest color, darkest blue, shows more than 600 deaths per 1 lakh population, and you find again the darkest color is present across continents, right, center, and left. You find those countries are there. So again, a reaffirmation that pandemic is active. Next slide, please. This is the Southeast Asia region where India is situated. The Southeast Asia region reported over 3,83,000 new cases and over 6,500 new deaths, decreases of 16% and 27% respectively as compared to the previous week. Incidence of cases and deaths has declined for nearly 2 months, with all countries in the region reporting a decrease in weekly cases for the past 2 weeks. This week, notable decreases were reported in Timor-Leste by 42% cases and 40% for deaths, and Indonesia by 40% cases and 48% deaths as compared to the last week. The highest number of new cases were reported from India, that is 2,11,000 new cases with 15% decrease. Thailand, 94,000 cases with 7% decrease. And Indonesia, 23,000 cases with 40% decrease. The highest number of new deaths were reported from India, that is 2,183 new deaths, which is similar to last week. Indonesia, 1,579 new deaths with 48% decrease, and Thailand, 1,010 new deaths with 33% decrease. And you are seeing the graph and evolution of the pandemic in the Southeast Asia region, which is almost similar to the pandemic graph of India. Next slide, please. This is the COVID India 19 snapshot where we have new cases in the last 24 hours, 29,559, 291 deaths, and 15.9 lakh tests yesterday. 7-day average test positivity rate has come to 2% now. There are active cases have come below 3 lakh, 2.94 lakh active cases, and they are shrinking by minus 1.8%. Total 3.36 crore cases have been reported in India with 4,46,690 deaths. 84 crore 83 lakh vaccination doses have been given, with 64.6 lakhs doses were given yesterday. Next slide, please. This is the data sheet where confirmed cases, deaths, tests per million per day, 7-day average test positivity rate, and 7-day average daily growth in percentage, and vaccinated persons with at least one dose in percentage have been shown with respect to the states in India, and they are ranked from the highest to the lowest, from top to bottom. If you look at each criteria, confirmed cases highest in the states of Kerala, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Mizoram, and Andhra Pradesh. Deaths highest in Kerala, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and West Bengal. Tests per million per day highest in Mizoram, J&K, Delhi, Kerala, and Pondicherry, and Goa. On the other hand, the lowest number of tests per million per day were in Andaman Nicobar, Dadra Nagar Haveli, Ladakh, Rajasthan, West Bengal, Haryana, Nagaland, Madhya Pradesh, and Chhattisgarh. Test 7-day average test positivity rate is highest in Mizoram, 17.4%, Kerala 14.9%, Sikkim 8.2%, Manipur 6.6%, Meghalaya 5.4%, and if you look at it, you will realize it's still present in the northeast part of the country and southern part of the country. It is still very much there. 7-day average daily growth in percentage, highest percentage is in Mizoram 1.56%, Kerala 0.4%, Meghalaya 0.22%, Sikkim 1.17%. So it is still growing in these states, Sikkim, Manipur, and Nagaland. Vaccinated persons with at least one dose in percentage, overall India is 46.11%, but Nagaland is 31.1%, Meghalaya is 32.38%, Jharkhand is 34.24%, Bihar is 34.44%, Uttar Pradesh is 35.27%. There has been improvement in some of the states. We shall discuss that in subsequent slide. We will talk more about it. Next slide, please. This is the global map, 4 maps for the 4 variants of concern: alpha, beta, gamma, and delta. On the left top is alpha in 193 countries, beta in 142 countries, gamma in 96 countries, and delta in 185 at the moment. And see how much spread all these variants of concern have gone in different countries and continents of the world. And in India, there are all 4 variants of concern still present. Next slide, please. This is a summary of phenotypic impacts of variants of concern, and kindly note transmissibility is increased in case of alpha, beta, gamma, and delta. Secondary attack rate, in addition, is very high in delta variant. Disease severity is there in alpha and delta. In alpha, there is increased risk of hospitalization, possible increased risk of severity and mortality, while in the delta, there is increased risk of hospitalization. Risk of reinfection in terms of delta is reduction in neutralizing activities been reported, but in alpha, neutralizing activity is retained, risk of reinfection remains similar. Impacts on diagnostics, though in Delta, there's none reported to date, but in Alpha, limited impact is there. S gene target failure, no impact on overall results from multiple target RT-PCR, and no impact on RDTs observed. Next slide. Increasing the vaccine coverage has been aided by improving the infrastructure on the ground. We shall now see the graph. Next slide, please. In large parts, India much improved COVID-19 vaccination efforts rest on boost in supply of jabs. However, that would not be enough if not for the infrastructure, which too is improving by the day. The average number of operational vaccination centers has increased to 65,780 this past week from 32,552 2 months ago. Within 2 months, doubling of the vaccination centers is amazing. India's record 22.8 million doses on 17 September was possible because it set up more than 110,000 centers that day, 43% more than the previous record. Madhya Pradesh, Assam, Telangana, Gujarat, and Haryana are the 5 states that were ramped up the most. They now average at least 3 times as many vaccination sites a day as they did 2 months ago. Each of these states has also administered at least 500 doses per 1,000 population. Among the states with the lowest vaccine distribution rates, while Bihar and Jharkhand have doubled the vaccinations since July, Uttar Pradesh has increased it by about 62%. Kerala, which has a coverage of 907 doses per 1,000 population, increased the number of sites from 1,005 in the third week of July to 1,622 this week. India has demonstrated its ability to ramp up distribution, but the key constraint will remain the production of vaccines. India has to administer 17.9 million doses a day to reach its target of 2.16 billion by the year end. In the last 7 days, it has averaged 9.7 million doses a day. Next slide, please. Another issue, India has led the most populous countries in vaccination coverage growth. If we look at the red bars, weekly change in COVID-19 vaccine doses per 100 people in percentage, India is at the top, 7.9. Indonesia second, 6.9. Bangladesh 6.9. Philippines 5.2. Cumulative COVID-19 vaccination per 100 people in gray bars. Highest you find is China 151.1 and Japan 122.9, Brazil 105.1 and US 115, while India is at 59 people per 100 people. India recorded the biggest ramp up in vaccination coverage this week among the 10 most populous countries. Bangladesh slid from its top slot to third. Even with an improved pace of growth of late, Bangladesh's vaccination coverage has remained the lowest in this group at 22 doses per 100 population. The country is set to receive vaccines from India in October as part of Serum Institute of India's commitment towards COVAX. Indonesia, which moved to the second spot this week, registered a 6.9% weekly growth in coverage as it aims to inoculate at least 70% of its population with at least 1 dose by November, when it plans to reopen its border. So far, 45% of its population has received at least the first dose. The Philippines, in 4th place, has maintained its high pace after receiving 9.8 million vaccines this week, mostly from China's Sinovac. Next slide, please. There is a worrisome comeback. Top 10 districts with the most new cases are from Kerala. Look at the color, the dark red color. India has reported a 4.4% growth in the number of new weekly infections, its first increase in 3 weeks. Of its 717 districts, 269 have seen a rise, with 61 reporting more than 100 cases. On the brighter side, 173 districts reported no new infection. Ladakh, Jammu Kashmir, Goa, and Mizoram saw the highest growth in the past week. Jammu Kashmir, which has seen a steady increase this month, reported 1,122 cases in the last 7 days, the most in a week since July. More than 50% of cases are from Srinagar. Ladakh reported 118 new cases, up from 32 last week. Cases in Leh shot up to 115 this week from 21 cases the week before, amid increased tourist presence. Kerala continues to report the most new cases, but its numbers have been consistently dropping. Mizoram saw a growth in cases for the 7th straight week, reporting more than 8,000 new cases in the past week. So that is the evolutionary aspect of COVID-19 in India. Next slide. Kerala has reported the highest number of deaths in the last 7 days. Deaths have been declining. India has continued to see a declining number of deaths because of COVID. The 2,120 COVID-related deaths this week were 2.7% lower than last week. 9 states and union territories reported no new deaths, and 14 reported fewer than 10 each. Kerala, which leads the role in the country, reported 1,052 deaths this week, more than the next 3 put together. Maharashtra reported 387 deaths, followed by Tamil Nadu, 154 deaths, and Karnataka, 131 deaths. The toll in Tamil Nadu has decreased since last week, but has risen in Maharashtra and Karnataka, which reported 131 deaths, up from 79 last week, mainly on account of an increase in Bangalore urban, Belgaum, and Udupi. Among districts, Thrissur, Malappuram, and Palakkad, all from Kerala, reported the most deaths. To ensure that more Indians do not die of COVID-19, the country has a challenge of further increasing the pace of vaccinations, even as it plans to resume vaccine exports. Now I'll share with you a video where the vaccine, how it should be looked at, is advocated in a summary 2 minutes video.
Scientists made multiple vaccines in less than a year. But a handful of countries grabbed virtually all the supply. Companies have not shared their recipes and technology. And while a small number of companies have made billions, there's not enough supply to go around. Every day, 10,000 people are dying. Fast-moving variants threaten to undermine progress. It's bad for health. It's bad for business. We can end this pandemic. There is hope. Some countries have started sharing doses. New manufacturing hubs are being built. Sharing of know-how and technology is beginning. And the majority of the world now backs a temporary waiver of intellectual property to help boost vaccine production. We are in a race against time to beat the virus, and we must all do more, faster. We can produce and deliver doses to vaccinate 70% of every country by the middle of 2022, including those in the hardest to reach places. No one is safe until we're all safe. It always seems impossible until it's done.
So vaccine equity has been highlighted, and without vaccine equity, we cannot hope that the pandemic will ever see a containment in its real effect. So if we have to see real containment, we have to ensure vaccine equity in the countries, within districts, and amongst countries across continents. Only then one can hope this pandemic will be contained. Next slide, please. Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity, Simone Weil said, and I'm really thankful to your generosity for your attention. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Rajiv Jain sir. Really, your presentation, it again opens our eyes that we should not be complacent, and we should not be of the opinion that the pandemic is over, and we should advocate the vaccination coverage amongst all the Indian citizens. And what you have told about the vaccine equity that need to be enforced, because yes, if we are vaccinated, but the people whom we come day in day out in contact, if they are not vaccinated or if they are not taking the precautions, then we won't be safe. So the vaccine equity is very much important, and the worrisome comeback in certain districts in Kerala, Jammu Kashmir, Ladakh, Goa, and Mizoram, that is also a cause of concern. And this test positivity rate, high test positivity rate in the southern states and the northeast, they are also a cause of concern. So we can say that the true pandemic is still existing, both at the global level, national level, and regional level also. So any questions from the panelist? Dr. Ghanshyam Dolera has one question. As some of the corona countries are starting giving booster dose of COVID vaccine, when at least for health workers, we can expect the third booster dose as antibodies means after 6 months. Dr. Rajiv Jain, sir?
Yes, very interesting question, Dr. Ghanshyam, and I welcome this bottoms up approach where people are worried and the demand for booster dose, at least for health workers, is increasing. That's fine, but one has to remember again, when we talk of vaccine equity, we have to remember one fact: it is not only the vaccine; it is the COVID appropriate behavior along with the vaccine which is going to be more effective. And when we talk of vaccine equity becomes very important. As I was mentioning in my presentation, at the moment, if you look at the country's map, there are large states, especially UP, Bihar, where the even single dose coverage is less than 40%. And remember, Delta variant, you can get protection against severe disease only when you have received the 2 doses along with 14 days gap after the second dose. Only then the real effect and advantage comes from the Delta variant. So our concentration and priority should remain at ensuring that people, number one, all the people in the country receive at least 1 dose, and also ensure that maximum persons receive the second dose also. So both these things have to have the highest priorities before we as a country can consider a limited take on scientific basis for giving the booster doses. It shall come. The government of India officially has been saying they will take up this subject after and at the right time. They will introduce the doses for the healthcare workers. Only yesterday, you must have found that technical group within CDC did not recommend the booster doses. Yet, CDC officially declared the recommendation for booster doses for old individuals and healthcare workers also. So even in US, where the vaccine production is very high, they are not exporting to other countries. There also this decision had just started. India will take up its policy decision in the months to come, but do not expect it to come before December this year. So sometime in the beginning of next year, maybe in a limited manner, the government could take a policy decision based on the technical advice, and the right time would be the right evolution of the pandemic. Thank you for asking this question in any case.
Actually, sir, the booster dose, it depends upon the scientific evidences. In America and Europe, these vaccines, they were giving long back in January, February. And at that time, we started the vaccination of our frontline health workers. So if the booster dose is to be given, it has to be given to the healthcare workers, because right now their immunity might be on decline, and they are more susceptible for breakthrough infections. So all this decision about booster dose will be based on the scientific evidences only. So let us hope, as Dr. Rajiv sir told, we may take some few months more by December or early next year. So, any other question from the panelists, if they have?
Yeah, I have a question, Dr. Rajiv. Dr. Rajiv, where do you see the vaccinations such as the nasal vaccines for children? Would that be better in case, we are not vaccinated too much to hold on and then maybe go for the vaccination of children and, that too nasal vaccines?
Well, that is a decision which is still under consideration at the technical group, that is the group which has been entrusted with this responsibility. The issue is under discussion at the moment. No recommendation has yet been made to the Government of India. And at the right time, that issue will be finalized. But the first pediatric vaccine will only be available to young adults above 12 years of age. 12 to 18 years of age will be the only population where, in a very limited manner, specifically children between 12 to 18 years of age with having comorbidities would be the only group which shall be allowed in the first phase to receive this vaccine. And Covaxin has been shown to be effective at the 12 to 18 years of age. And you will find this recommendation may be coming not earlier than November, I think. And nasal vaccine, yes, it is under clinical trial, and it should see the light of day sooner than we expect. And I think a range of vaccine will be available for 12 to 18 years of group sometime from November onwards. It is the production also which has to follow the clinical trial. Sufficient doses and then the infrastructure on the ground to administer these vaccines over a large part of the country would be required. So that development is occurring simultaneously, once on the production side, other on the distribution and storage sides. And that decision will be dependent on having the mapping for the vulnerable children who should require this. It will never be that all the children between 12 to 18 years of age shall be allowed to receive the vaccine. That is not under consideration in any of the technical group at the moment. And TAGI is not considering that aspect at the current juncture of discussion.
All right. Thank you very much, sir.
So, you mean to say, sir, that now many countries like US also, they are allowing foreign travelers even on tourist visa but they should be fully vaccinated and RT-PCR negative in last 72 hours. So in that case, the children 12 to 18 years of age, they won't be vaccinated before November. Means they won't be allowed or permitted by the countries to visit along with their families.
As you had seen in the earlier dispensation, where the second dose was the difference between the first and second dose was reduced, especially for international travelers. Same will happen for children between 12 to 18 years of age. Specific requirements and the specific dispensation could be made at the appropriate time. But first, the decision from NTAGI or the recommendation from NTAGI to the Government of India for introduction of vaccine for 12 to 18 years old children is yet in the discussion phase. There's no recommendation made by the NTAGI to the Government of India as yet, because of multiple factors, because of the pace of adult vaccination and because of the requirement that adult vaccination has to reach a level where it has to saturate more than 90% population before you start thinking of administering 12 to 18 years age group. That is an area where Government of India at the moment is not considering to introduce the subject at the moment. And it's a fair decision, I think.
Dr. Sanjay Rauti.
Yeah, good evening, sir. It is always nice as always, right? So what I want to ask you is your first slide shows cumulative graphs, right? And if though regional graphs show differences, but the cumulative graph shows is typically a shoulder formation, a head formation, second wave was high, and now it is definitely we are in a descending of the third wave, right?
Yes,
Huh.
very true. The global
So-
graph, if you look at it, the
Yeah.
third wave is in the descending phase, but
Yeah.
it is still very high. If you see that, it is nowhere near the base.
That is true, but always when head shoulder pattern, whenever it is
Yes.
discussed, when it breaks out the neckline, it comes to the baseline.
May not, because
Yeah,
of
that's true.
the-
It may be
the variance. The behavior
variance and the number of the
difficult.
cases may be there. But looking at
Yeah.
the R0 value again going to 0.9 in India. So I believe at least Southeast Asia is getting a good relief. And
Yes.
cumulatively, it may be dropping faster.
But on the other hand, look at the Eastern Pacific, the Western Pacific region. What do you
Yeah.
see? The four
Yeah.
waves, one wave higher than the other.
Correct.
So that is very, very, very scary.
Yeah.
So what is the guarantee the fifth wave will not come in Western Pacific region like Australia?
Yeah,
Australia
but-
was very confident that things will normalize. But
Yeah.
look at the situation on the ground. 2 months, major cities in Australia have had a lockdown, more than 2 months. And now
I
they're
know.
seeing agitation by the public that it should not be extended further. But government of Australia is not taking any decision to soften the hard lockdown.
So actually what we expect is only the virulence of the mutants.
Very true.
Yeah.
In fact, that is why if you're seeing this week in India also, for the first time, Government of India has allowed private laboratories to do genetic analysis,
Right.
only to ensure that the more number of samples from wider areas are analyzed in terms of their genetic composition. Because only then you will have the real time on ground evolution of the variants of concern and also variants of interest. So that is also a big, I think, development in India. Other countries also following, but unfortunately, there is no equity in the world in terms of genetic analysis. UK still conducts 50% of genetic analysis in the world today.
Yeah.
Only UK. So there is a inequity in the system or the infrastructure for genetic analysis of these viruses.
Right, sir.
Last question from Dr. Hitesh Singhala from Jamnagar. What is your expectation of third wave?
Third wave in India?
Yeah.
Well, India is a continent. It's not a country in its behavior. If you see, Delhi had fourth wave already. So if we talk of the country, the third wave may be there. But we say in terms of its impact or its scale, definitely third wave will be much lower than the second wave. That is for sure. That is the way the virus has been evolving in India at least. So there should not be a very high concern or fear. What we need is pragmatism and surveillance being kept all through so that we are prepared to manage the third wave. And we remember, we have managed second wave in a very, very effective manner. If you see the challenge that was available and the preparedness that was there and the infrastructure that was there. In spite of that, the evolution and as Dr. Ratithor was mentioning, the shoulder and you see the descent, it happened very fast. So if it would have stretched to come to the bottom and it would have, the speed of fall would have been very slow, things would have gone anyway. But at the moment, you see a steep increase and a steep decline. Though the decline is not touching the bottom. It's taking time. So we should only concentrate our energies towards management of the second wave in India at the moment. Not think of the third wave, fine. Government of India is trying its best to create infrastructure like oxygen and more ICU beds, but that is there, that will keep on going. But first we must concentrate, are we sure that second wave is off? No, you must have seen, Dr. Sandeep, the graph is not showing the total abatement of the second wave at the moment.
Yeah, it has not touched the bottom still. So any other question if the panelists are having? Otherwise, we'll conclude the session. It's almost 2 hours now. The recordings will be shortly available on our Enoch DigiConnect webinar YouTube channel, which can be referred to. And I would request those who have not attended, they can go through that proceedings and they can subscribe the channel. Already more than 90 videos are there, which are a good repository from the learned faculties. So with this, we thank Dr. Manish for giving an overview of the best cancer management, screening, and a lot of points they are clear, and we have to take you on board for further discussion regarding the targeted therapies and the immunotherapies, because that is a burning point in management of these cancers in many of the organizations, whether we should allow it in our policy or we should give it permission to the specific cases. So all these things we need to discuss, and we will take your time for that also. And thank you, Dr. Rajiv sir, also for giving an overview of the COVID updates and regarding the vaccines, vaccine coverage, equity of vaccines. Still the pandemic is very much there. It is still evolving in certain areas, and we need to be still very careful with all these precautions. We should stay safe so that we can take care of others. So thank you all very much. Yeah, thank you very much, all
Thank
the
you.
participants, all the learned
Thank you
faculty,
so much.
Thank you all.
the panelists. Thank you.
So one